Let me start by saying first, it's very much an honor and a pleasure to be here in London at LSE to give some light on my experience as a Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo Bay and expound a little bit more on how that has really affected the lives of Muslims in America and perhaps here in the UK and elsewhere around the world. I want to thank Like Media, Amnesty, LSE, ISOC for making this possible. Thank all of you who are here today to take part in this presentation. I'll begin by giving you a little bit of a background of who I am. Okay, I'm a third generation Chinese American. Third generation. So it was my grandparents who came from southern China, immigrated to the United States. Both of my parents were born in the US, and my two older sisters, two younger brothers, all born in the US. So that makes me a third generation Chinese American. You heard I am a former military chaplain, but prior to serving as a military chaplain, I also served as an air defense artillery officer in the US Army before becoming a chaplain. But I come from a family that's rooted in the military now. I'm a graduate of West Point, the prestigious United States Military Academy. My younger brother is also a graduate of West Point. My other younger brother has served as a US Army doctor. And my dad, who I mentioned, is a US citizen, born in the US, also served in the US Army when he was drafted during World War II. Right, so I come from a family that has its roots now in the military, so in some way, in some shape or form or fashion, the males in my family have all contributed to this idea of national security. And then also, I am also a Muslim convert, or some might say a Muslim revert. I converted to Islam after having been raised Lutheran, which is one of the more liturgical Protestant denominations. And I wish tonight I had more time to go into my journey to Islam and what led me to becoming a Muslim, but maybe that's another lecture, another presentation, and maybe I'll have the honor and the opportunity to come back and share that story with you sometime in the future. But today, I want to touch upon Guantanamo Bay. And why Guantanamo Bay in the post-9/11 era? Because just last month, on January 11th, 2012, that day marked the 10th shameful anniversary of Guantanamo Bay and the holding of prisoners by the US military in this now infamous prison camp. So I want to focus on that, and particularly focus on my experience and shed some light on what has gone on inside this prison camp and what has happened here or happened there in Guantanamo. An experience from firsthand being the chaplain to the prisoners down there back in 2002 and 2003. I was given the assignment in probably mid-2002 to be the chaplain at Guantanamo, sent by the US Army following the tragic attacks of 9/11 on the World Trade Center in New York City, on the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And then there was also a fourth flight that would crash, that was hijacked in Pennsylvania. Right? Following those attacks, I was singled out as a Muslim chaplain serving the ranks of our US military to go down and become the chaplain to the prisoners being held in this camp. Right? And I was sent there because each and every one of these prisoners held in Guantanamo was Muslim. And at that time, in late 2002, most of 2003, when I was serving there as the chaplain, the numbers in this prison camp reached almost 700. There were some 680 individuals being held in Guantanamo Bay, each and every one of them Muslim, each and every one of them suspected of being an Al-Qaeda or Taliban terrorist. But I will say that in November of 2002, when I got to Guantanamo, and throughout my time to September of 2003, I will say that during my time in Guantanamo, not one of those individuals held in Guantanamo can be definitively or directly associated with the attacks that occurred on 9/11 in New York City, Washington, D.C., or Pennsylvania. Not one. And why do I say that? Of the 680 prisoners who were there? I say that because if the United States, if my country, if the US military, the ranks that I was serving, had actually during that time captured a legitimate terrorist suspect, those people were not brought to Guantanamo during that time. They were instead put in a secret CIA black site somewhere we don't know, maybe in Egypt, maybe in Libya, maybe somewhere in the Indian Ocean, maybe on an island called Diego Garcia, or on an aircraft carrier in the ocean, as suggested by the Washington Post when they revealed that the US was operating secret CIA black sites in that immediate post-9/11 aftermath. That's where those terrorist suspects were taken, not to Guantanamo Bay. So that's why I say it's not a reality in 2002 and 2003 to say that there were 9/11 terrorist suspects held in Guantanamo when I was there. The mass majority of them, we can say, were innocent. Today, there are still 171 prisoners being held in Guantanamo. And that tells you that over 500 of them have been released, sent back to their countries. If they were really terrorists, we would have never released them back to their countries. Right? Most of them never charged with a crime, even put in a court of law. Right? That's the reality of who was in Guantanamo. When I got down to Guantanamo, I learned of what my role would be as a chaplain at this prison camp. I would be an advisor to the camp commander on religious practices, religious worship observances of these prisoners in Guantanamo. And because I am Muslim, because they were Muslim, I was able to advise the command on aspects of Islamic prayer, fasting during the month of Ramadan, as these prisoners were being held even during that time. Right? Things like that. That was one role. The other role I had was to be a chaplain to all of the Muslims in Guantanamo. Not only these hundreds of Muslim prisoners being held, but also to the many American Muslims in Guantanamo who was serving this joint task force operation, most of them as translators, most of them as interpreters. Right? So the population of Muslim prisoners, these 680 so people, they represented maybe 40 different countries in Guantanamo. 40 different nations. So how many languages then do you think were spoken in Guantanamo? Lots of languages, from Arabic, Pashto, Farsi, Urdu. There were even some 36 prisoners from Western China. So you have Chinese, right? European languages included French and German, also spoken by prisoners at Gitmo. From the UK, there were 9 British citizens and several other British residents held in Guantanamo. Right? Who handled the linguistic needs of this military operation at that time? American translators. Most of whom were American Muslims because of these diverse languages. Right? So it was the American Muslims who was essentially what I would call my congregation down in Guantanamo, who could attend the weekly Friday worship service, which we call Jummah prayer on Fridays. The Muslim prisoners, they couldn't attend because they were confined to their cage-like cells, images of which I will show you later in this presentation. Right? They weren't allowed to join religious worship in congregation. They were in their cells, in these cell blocks, in a place called Camp Delta. That was my role. Those two aspects were essentially my role as a chaplain in Guantanamo. But from the very first day that I stepped into a cell block in Guantanamo, it was quite clear that prisoners in Guantanamo were not being treated very nicely. In fact, they were being mistreated. They were being abused to the level which many human rights organizations, even US officials, have termed torture in Guantanamo Bay. And today, Guantanamo Bay stands out as a symbol around the world of American torture and violation of human rights and the rule of law. And that's one reason why I feel that Guantanamo Bay needs to be closed right now. But when I got down to Guantanamo and learned very quickly how prisoners were being mistreated, these were things that I would quickly address with the command during my time at Gitmo. But what was very disturbing to me when I was a chaplain at Guantanamo was to see how religion was being used as a weapon in this facility. Right? People in Guantanamo, Muslims, were essentially being persecuted because they were Muslim. And to just give one example of a prisoner who described for me being taken into an interrogation cell, right? Shackled at the wrist, at the waist, the ankles, in a suit of chains, in the manner in which prisoners are shackled at Guantanamo. Right? He would describe for me how he was taken into an interrogation room. On the floor of this interrogation room was a large circle. In the center of that circle on the floor was a satanic type symbol, a star, pentagram shaped symbol that represents Satan. The interrogator would take that Muslim prisoner and attempt to force him to bow down, to make prostration, like in the form of the Muslim prayer, in the center of this satanic circle, while this American translator would scream at him that Satan is your God now, not Allah, meaning not God the Almighty, the creator of the heavens and earth. And this was done because these intelligence officers, these interrogators, understood that Muslims believe in that monotheistic faith of one God, that pure belief in one God. That was understood, and this was an attempt to break this faith, to break the prisoner down, thinking that that could help this interrogator glean some type of information or intelligence from that prisoner. And later, many of the American translators would verify for me that indeed, that some of these type tactics did occur in these intelligence sessions, these interrogation sessions. Many of the American translators who attended my congregational service, my prayer service on Fridays, Jumu'ah prayer, worked in those interrogation sessions as translators, translating between prisoner and interrogator. But that was just one particular way in which religion was being used as a weapon against these individuals. Now, for me as American, born in the United States, when I grew up and went to school, in elementary school, and learned American history, what are we taught? We're taught in American schools that America was founded on the principle of religious freedom. It was the Pilgrims who they said sailed across the oceans, came to the New World to find a place where they could practice their faith, their religion, in the way that they wanted, even if it was a puritanical view of their religion. Right? But they came to the New World to find religious freedom. So that was the very first cause, the very first struggle in America. But in Guantanamo Bay, in this day, I saw the opposite. America, U.S. personnel, military personnel, federal intelligence officers, guards and whatnot, turning the table and instead persecuting people for their faith, something that I felt went contrary to my country's Constitution, First Amendment right to religious freedom, and my role as a chaplain to accommodate religious practices of prisoners being held in Guantanamo. So I would raise concerns about what was going on in this prison camp, bringing information to my chain of command, the colonel who oversaw the detention side of the operation. And I actually believe that my input, my information that I brought to the commander was valued because I was given awards, official military awards, while I was in Guantanamo. I received a stellar officer evaluation report during my time in Guantanamo. And then I received what we call in the military R&R, rest relaxation. That's when any soldier in the U.S. military, if they're deployed for a lengthy period of time, might get the opportunity to go home, see his family or her family, see their parents, knowing that just after a week or two of rest, of relaxation time, they would have to go back to their military duty, their military mission, their military deployment. After 10 months in Guantanamo, I got R&R. So I got on a plane from Guantanamo, landed in Jacksonville, Florida, had a connecting flight back to the West Coast where I had been residing to meet my wife and daughter. But I never was able to get on that connecting flight. Because when my plane landed in the United States, I was swarmed by customs officials, immigration officers, intelligence operatives, Army counterintelligence, naval criminal investigators, NCIS. And yes, also the FBI. 2 agents of the FBI were there as well. Right? I was arrested in secret after agents claimed that I was carrying some suspicious documents and then said I was carrying classified documents. I was then thrown in shackles, the wrist, waist, ankles, and put in single solitary confinement in a cell. It was like I had disappeared in America because I was arrested in secret. My wife, my daughter were waiting for me at the airport. I never showed up. My parents hadn't heard of any plan changes. They didn't know where I was. But after about 2 weeks, they learned, as well as the world learned, when my picture was the headline of that day in September of 2003, that the Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo Bay had been arrested, and that I was now in a super maximum security prison elsewhere in the United States. The headlines were swirling that I was this terrorist spy. I was being accused by my own government, by the US military, of spying, espionage, aiding the enemy, mutiny and sedition, offenses which you can get the death penalty for, especially during a time of war. Right? And indeed, some military lawyers, military prosecutors threatened me with the death penalty in those very first days of my arrest. Right? But now I'm sitting in this single solitary cell. When I was transferred to this prison, I was subjected to what's known as sensory deprivation, where blackened out goggles were put over my eyes, these ear devices put over my ears. Again, I was shackled in those chains in the same way that Guantanamo prisoners were shackled. That was very frightening for me, because I understood, being in Guantanamo, that the president at that time, George Bush, had said prisoners in Guantanamo don't have rights. When I was being treated in that very same manner, that became frightening for me, because then I feared that even as a US citizen, my country would be stripping me of all of my rights. I didn't know where they were taking me. I was being treated like a terrorist. This is in the immediate post 9/11 aftermath. I didn't know what was going to happen. But I was in that cell for 76 days. After 76 days, and after thorough investigation of my life by probably every intelligence agency of the United States, I was released. None of those charges were actually brought against me officially, although the military did attempt to try me on what they called mishandling classified information. But after months of further investigation, even those charges were dropped, as it was clear that I was really never carrying any classified information. So there was no case there either. I was reinstated as a chaplain back at my home base in Fort Lewis in Washington State. And then I would, after getting there, tender my resignation from the US military, and in January 2005, I received an honorable discharge. And when I separated from the military in January 2005, I also received a second US Army Commendation Medal for, quote, exceptionally meritorious service. Right? I got that final award on my way out, after having been locked up in a prison cell for 76 days, solitary confinement, treated like a terrorist, accused of being a spy, a traitor to my country. And I believe that getting that award, getting that honorable discharge, was the US military admitting that they made a huge mistake in lieu of apologizing to me. And to this day, no one in any official position of leadership in the United States government or military has ever apologized for the way I was treated. Right? But that's Guantanamo Bay. That is what has occurred in Guantanamo Bay, and what has led to my life being changed upside down post 9/11. Right? But I believe that 9/11 and Guantanamo Bay and other things like this prison have really had a negative effect on American society in particular, and certainly Muslims in America have experienced severe consequences. And I'm going to touch upon those. But let me show you. I've talked a little bit about my experience as a chaplain, what goes on inside Guantanamo, the operation. But now let's look at Guantanamo at some photos. This here is a photo of Camp Delta, the front gates of Camp Delta, where I served when I got there in November of 2002. A quick photo of how prisoners were initially transported to Guantanamo in the back of these big open-air military cargo planes. It's disturbing to see individuals like this being hooded in these black hoods, but also, to me, what's disturbing as an American citizen is that flag that hangs over their head. Because this photo is demonstrating to the world that this is an American operation, that this is how America treats its prisoners. Again, transport to Guantanamo. Camp X-Ray, though, was the first facility opened on January 11, 2002. January 11th. So that's the date. As I mentioned just last month, January 11th, 2012 marked the 10th anniversary. The 10th shameful anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo Bay. Camp X-Ray, the cells were made of chain link fences, as you can see in this photo. Very makeshift, very temporary. It was only in operation for 3 months. That's a closer look at the sensory deprivation that Guantanamo prisoners were often subjected to. I was subjected to that when I was transported to that prison after being arrested. The goggles, the earmuffs. I didn't have the mask, though, on my mouth. They didn't cover my mouth with this surgical type mask. But it would be said later that prisoners being carted off to Guantanamo should have their mouths covered, because people would say that they were so dangerous that they would chew through the hydraulic lines of planes to bring it down. That's how dangerous these individuals were. We can maybe prevent that if we subject them to treatment like this, strap them up, and even ensure that their mouths were covered. Very ridiculous. That's an overhead shot of Camp X-Ray. Not a facility that you would think human beings would be kept in, but maybe something more suitable for dogs or animals, cattle, or whatnot. And indeed, many of the prisoners would come to me or would explain to me, describe for me, that they felt as if they were indeed being treated like animals. But by the time I got to Guantanamo, Camp X-Ray had been closed, Camp Delta was built. The cell blocks in Camp Delta were made of much stronger steel mesh, like these. There were about 15 to 20 cell blocks like these in Camp Delta, each cell block holding 48 cells. 24 on one side, 24 on the other, a long corridor down the middle. If you go into this cell block, that's what it looked like. See, each of those doors is one cage-like cell that housed one prisoner. 24 on one side, 24 on the other. Right? I spent my days inside cell blocks like this, talking to prisoner after prisoner after prisoner, as they brought to me their concerns about how they were being mistreated at this prison camp. That's what the cubicle looked like. Right? Of course, that's the cubicle of what it looks like after the U.S. military mops the floor up, makes it shine, and then they describe it to you like this. The prisoners in Guantanamo are being treated very nicely. These Muslims, they have their own in-ground toilet that they're culturally familiar with. There's a little water fountain that they can drink from or use to wash before prayer. Look how good these prisoners in Guantanamo are being treated. That's how the U.S. military pitches it to those delegates who come down and want to see the prison camp. We even put the arrow pointing to Mecca so that Muslim prisoners can pray in the proper direction. Interestingly enough, in the very first days, they actually showed how far away from Mecca they were. Right? Maybe they get some extra packets of salt to make the food taste better. Actually, in Guantanamo, in the regulations, these are referred to as comfort items. Comfort items. As if they may be staying in the Comfort Inn, a hotel. Certainly not 5-star, right? But really, that's what they got. An empty cell, a flimsy plastic mattress, they were confined to that cell most days, 24 hours a day, not coming out even for recreation. Very rare that they had that opportunity. Right. Later, the cells would be retrofitted like this, and that's a closer look at that steel mesh that these prisoners looked through on a daily basis. This was in the early stages of Camp Delta, 2003, 2002. Okay. I put this picture up here, and I refer to this individual as being a detainee. And I make that point because we were ordered in Guantanamo to call these people detainees, not prisoners. In my presentations, I try to make it a point to refer to them as prisoners. But in Guantanamo, they said, no, prisoners, if we call them prisoners, that might give someone the impression that they could be prisoners of war. But under Geneva Conventions, the international body of law for armed conflict, prisoners of war have what? Have rights. But George Bush, the president of the previous administration in the United States, said, no, these individuals don't have rights, so we call them detainees. Right. Camp 4 was later built in Guantanamo when I was there. It was like a carrot stick. It was like an incentive for prisoners to cooperate with their interrogator, to be well behaved, and if they did, they might get housed in an open bay like this and live amongst other prisoners at Guantanamo. And this was the only place where actual prisoners in Guantanamo could pray together. And you can see that if they made it to Camp 4, they can get out of those orange jumpsuits and they can get these nice white uniforms. Right? Again, it was an incentive. Very few individuals ever made it to Camp 4. Camp Iguana, this is a place in Guantanamo where they housed the juvenile enemy combatants, those prisoners in Guantanamo who were 12 years old or 14 years old, those under the age of 16. Anyone under the age of 16 were held here. There were at least 3 prisoners from Afghanistan who were held in this facility. I used to meet with them on a weekly basis. Right? And my impression of them, they were like any ordinary 12-year-old boys that I knew. Right? There were other juveniles in Guantanamo held in general population who were between the ages of 16 and 18. But the U.S. military considered them adults and were housed in general population. That was one of them. He's still in Guantanamo. He was actually picked up by the U.S. military in Afghanistan when he was 15. He's a Canadian citizen. He's actually the last Western citizen still in Guantanamo. Right? He's like 24 now. Right? This is a picture of him when he was captured. Right? He was in some kind of house. It was bombed by the U.S. military. He's actually accused of having thrown a hand grenade, killing an American soldier. But you can see the wounds in his body. That's not where ammunition entered his body. It's where it came out, which tells you what? He was shot in the back. Right? And actually in Guantanamo, he would reveal to me that he was in Afghanistan when U.S. military raided the house that he was living in. He was scared. He didn't know what was going on. He essentially curled up with his back to the military or the forces that came in, and that's when he got shot. The U.S. military did, after that, perhaps save his life. After they shot him up, he would end up in Guantanamo being considered a terror suspect. Camp Echo was also built in Guantanamo when I was there. It was a much more isolated facility, a single cell where a prisoner, if held in Camp Echo, in a cell like this, didn't have any contact with even other prisoners. Camp 5 was later built. Wasn't there when I was in Guantanamo in 2003. But look at this facility. Concrete floors, heavy steel locking doors. A facility that houses maybe 50 to 100 prisoners. Right? This being built in Guantanamo indicated to me that Guantanamo was becoming very permanent. And the cell inside Camp 5 looks like this. Even more claustrophobic than that cage-like cell of Camp Delta. And then later Camp 6 was built. Holds up to 200 prisoners. And my understanding today is that most of the prisoners of those 171 who were still there are housed in Camp 5 and 6 now, out of Camp Delta. Then there's also what's referred to as Camp 7, or some people call it Camp No. And why would you call it Camp No? Because some people say it doesn't really exist, but it does exist. And that's where the US military houses the high profile, the terrorist suspects that were actually taken out of those CIA black sites that I referred to in the beginning and brought them to Guantanamo. That was done in late 2006. President Bush brought 19 individuals out of the CIA black sites, brought them to Guantanamo, and publicized that he had brought them to Guantanamo in order to convince the US Congress that there indeed were legitimate terrorist suspects now at Guantanamo, and then they passed a law called the Military Commissions Act of 2006. That's what an interrogation room looks like, with a D-ring on the ground, very suitable for a stress position called short shackling when prisoners are interrogated. Detainee hospital, prisoners go on hunger strike because they've been there so long. They don't have rights, no due process. Most of them held indefinitely without charge. Some of them have turned to hunger striking. But the US military does not allow them to die from hunger striking. Instead, they get strapped into these chairs so they can't resist. And then take a tube and they shove it down the nose, the nostril of the prisoner, and they force feed that individual with a liquid type diet to keep that person alive. That's a picture of a former prisoner, Sami al-Hajj, who actually was a cameraman for Al Jazeera. A depiction of what he felt like when he was force-fed on a hunger strike. Okay. But in 2008, actually last time I visited the UK was in 2008, and I was very hopeful at that time because there was a guy named Barack Obama who was running for president. Actually, I think by the time I got here, he had already been elected president. Right? But he was campaigning, and in his campaign he promised that when president, he would close Guantanamo Bay, that he would ban torture without exception, that he would rid Guantanamo of these military commissions or these tribunals that have lack of rights when trying a prisoner in Guantanamo for any crimes. Right? And I thought, hey, this guy is a graduate of Harvard Law School, a constitutional law expert, even having been a professor of constitutional law. Who better to clean up this mess in Guantanamo than someone like Barack Obama? And he won that historical election in 2009. And on the second day of office, he even signed an executive order in 2009, 2 days after taking office, that he would close Guantanamo in 1 year. Right? I voted for Barack Obama. I said, wow, this guy is really going to do the job. Right? And he even proposed bringing prisoners from Guantanamo to the United States in a similar type facility, but at least they would have rights in the federal courts in America and be given due process. But that never happened. Instead, we saw January 2010 come by, then January 2011, then last month, January 2012. Guantanamo is still open. It hasn't been closed down. And even the US Congress has passed legislation preventing prisoners from Guantanamo or preventing military funds being used to move prisoners at Guantanamo to the United States. So they will never come to US soil and get in a federal court. Right? Guantanamo seems today to be much more permanent under the Obama administration than it was even in the Bush administration. But Guantanamo Bay and 9/11, in my view, has really opened the doors to something that I call Islamophobia. Right? And what is Islamophobia? Islamophobia can be defined as an irrational fear or hostility towards Islam and Muslims. And it can lead to discrimination, profiling, violation of constitutional rights, hate crime, anti-Muslim rhetoric, and whatnot. And this has been ongoing in the last decade in America. People on the radio and in media like this guy, a shock jock radio host, who in his rhetoric says maybe the US Congress should legislate laws that ban Muslims from coming to America, or bans the construction of Islamic centers and mosques. We see media personnel, like people like this guy, celebrity, Bill Maher from this TV show called Real Time on HBO, making a statement like this, saying, I think it's fair to say Muslim men have a bad attitude about women in general. So here he is characterizing all Muslim men. When I was living in Washington State, this imam that we see from Indonesia on the right, a prominent imam, religious clergy person, gave the opening invocation to a state senate legislative session. This woman was a representative at that time. She would walk out of that prayer, and when asked why she did so, she said it was a matter of patriotism, or it was an issue of patriotism, insinuating or suggesting that it was her patriotic duty as an American to walk out of this prayer because it was being given by a Muslim. Right? This guy used to be in the US Congress, and he said in an interview, in response to a question asking what could America do to respond to biological terrorists, he said, well, maybe we could take out their holy sites. You know, like bombing Mecca, for example, would be a possible solution. Because that's where Muslims go and make pilgrimage once a year. But then in 2006, Keith Ellison, the first American Muslim, was elected to the US Congress. Right? And when he did so, he announced that when he takes his swearing-in ceremony, he was going to do it on the Quran. And when he made that announcement, media people wanted to interview him and were causing controversy. And this guy on CNN named Glenn Beck, he would ask Keith Ellison in an interview, sir, prove to me that you are not working with our enemies. I mean, this guy is an African-American Muslim born in America, right? And where does this question come from? Comes from him being a Muslim. A sitting congressman at the time said that Keith Ellison's intention to do the swearing ceremony on the Quran would be, quote, a threat to the values and beliefs traditional to the United States of America. Right? But when Keith Ellison did do that swearing-in ceremony, what did he do? He went to the U.S. Library of Congress and he borrowed the Quran that was translated years ago that was owned by a fellow named Thomas Jefferson, a guy who authored the U.S. Constitution. He himself had a translation of the Quran in his professional library. And that book is still preserved today in the U.S. Library of Congress. Keith Ellison went, borrowed that book, and you see in that 2-volume translation is the Quran actually owned by Thomas Jefferson, one of the authors of the U.S. Constitution. And that quieted many of his critics. Right. But Islamophobia certainly was indeed a part of the 2008 historical president election of Barack Obama. This was called a terrorist fist jab by a Fox News commentator. Right? And that terrorist fist jab was later satirized on a magazine cover by the New Yorker magazine. And look how they dressed Barack Obama up, you know, in some Muslim garb, right? Or with a turban, right? And look at Michelle, what's around her shoulder? Some AK-47 ammunition, you know, and suggesting that perhaps they may be terrorists. Right? And if you did live in upstate New York during that election and voted by absentee ballot, this is what you received in the mail. You can vote for John McCain and Sarah Palin, but you could also vote for Barack Osama and Joe Biden. Right? Not Barack Obama, Barack Osama. And who's the most famous Osama in the world? Or was? But that was just a typo. Of course, the county later would apologize and say, we made a mistake. Today, during the 2012 presidential election, some of the candidates have had really strong anti-Muslim rhetoric. This individual, Michelle Bachmann, who was at one point perhaps a favorite of the Republican Party, recently dropped out of the race. But she had recently said that people who attended Keith Ellison's victory party when he was elected into Congress were, quote, anti-Bush, they were anti-American, and they, quote, fit the pattern of 9/11 terrorists. Right. Congressman Allen West, who is sitting in the state of Florida as a congressman in the United States, said that Keith Ellison himself, as a Muslim, represents the antithesis of principles upon which this country, the United States, was established. Right. Rick Santorum, who is still a potential candidate for presidency of 2012, recently was asked by Wolf Blitzer of CNN, who would he consider being profiled? And he said the first people that should be profiled should be Muslims. And Newt Gingrich, who is probably right now one or two of the favorites to get the primary candidacy for the Republican Party of the 2012 presidential election in America, said that in response to a question if he would ever support a Muslim running for president, he said only if that person would commit in public to give up Sharia. Sharia. Not understanding what Sharia law is, or what Sharia is. And just for those who may not understand, Sharia, for example, tells me that I should pray 5 times a day. Right? Sharia tells me that I should respect my mother, because there's a saying by the Prophet Muhammad that paradise is at the foot of our mothers. In Arabic, Jannah tahta aqdam al-ummahat. Paradise is at the foot of our mothers, which tells us as Muslims we should respect our mothers. Why would you want to ban something like that? Right? Because people have a misunderstanding of what Sharia law is. And actually in America, in several local states, legislation has submitted proposals to actually ban Sharia even at a local level. Right? But that's what can happen with Islamophobia in America. I want to point to some other things of how Islamophobia has really ratcheted up in America. And this is really serious. These are some slides that were leaked to the website Wired.com. Training slides by the FBI, teaching agents of the FBI, our U.S. intelligence agency, about Islam and Muslims. And they characterize the Prophet Muhammad as being a cult leader. They characterize the Prophet Muhammad as someone who ordered the assassinations of his critics, right? Who employed torture. Right? The training slide said that hadith, which is the second source of Islamic law, generally referred to as prophetic traditions, things the Prophet Muhammad himself said and did, right? They refer to hadith, or define hadith as a tactical manual for jihad. So when you see these types of things, what kind of impression do FBI agents get about Muslims and Islam when you're teaching them these things? They define zakat, and zakat, that is in Islam the religious obligation for Muslims to give charity to the poor. But the FBI trains their agents saying zakat is, quote, the funding mechanism for combat. Right? Combat support, combat service operations. That's how they fund their jihad. Right? And when they compared Islam to other religions, Judaism, Catholic, even realists, someone who doesn't have religion, they said those are passive and defensive, but Islam is offensive and aggressive. Right? They put this chart up there. They said if you're a follower of the Torah, you will go towards a nonviolent path. If you're a follower of the Bible, you will also follow a nonviolent path. But if you are a follower of the Quran, you go towards a violent path. And if you're more pious and more devout, you become more violent. Right? These are some recent training slides, as recent as 2011, that have been used to train FBI agents in the United States about Islam and Muslims. Right? That could only lead to biased investigations of crimes, even crimes of terrorism. Right? And the trainer would say that these are mainstream Islamic views. You know, not extreme or radical views of some Muslims, but mainstream. Right? And it's interesting that trainer has been on record as saying that Muhammad's mindset is a source for terrorism. That in order to fight terrorism, we should go after Islam itself, undermine Islamic scriptures like Quranic passages, and undermine Muslim leaders, which tells me that our intelligence agencies in the US, I don't know here in the UK, but I believe that they are looking to undermine Muslim leadership in the United States. Right? So this is how Islamophobia, when we see things like 9/11, Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, has led to Islamophobia in America and perhaps elsewhere around the world. I'm not as versed as some of the things that are going on here in the UK, but indeed there are probably just as many cases that we see people getting arrested for ridiculous, improper or fantasy associations with terrorism in the jails, maybe here in this country as in the United States. But that's just a little bit of commentary on my experience as a chaplain in the U.S. military and what I see going on in America today. No doubt the history of America has shown that different groups have been persecuted and discriminated against religiously, like Catholics, like Jews and other religions, other ethnic groups, like the Japanese during World War II, who were thrown in internment camps in America, like African Americans in America, who were even at times lynched and hung with rope by the trees, you know, off of a tree, things like that. And today it seems as if the Muslim community now is just the latest example where a particular group is facing these types of challenges. I want to conclude there and leave some time for all of you to ask questions, for your comments, and also I'm very interested in hearing some of your insights. But again, my name is James Yusuf Yee, former chaplain of the U.S. military who served in Guantanamo Bay, and it's been a pleasure sharing with you some of my experience and thoughts. Thank you very much.